My name is Sebastian Vos. I'm a partner at Covington, based in Brussels, and I've had the privilege of working with the GBBC more or less since it began. And I have to say, when I look around me at this amazing place and the amazing people in it, I'm incredibly impressed at the way it's developed. So a big congratulations to Jamaica, Marcina, Sandra, all the others. I also am incredibly impressed at how easy you guys have made it to do this panel, except for one unfortunate panel member missing a plane yesterday in Brussels, but that almost happened to me too, so she'll be forgiven. It really could not have been easier. I do a fair bit of moderating, and it's never been this easy, so thank you guys for that. We've got a great group of people sitting here at the panel. The title, as you will either have known already or be able to read behind us, is Borderless, Law and Order in a Decentralized World. Could be a movie, but it's a panel. As it turns out, we have the one person who unfortunately wasn't able to make it, Eva Kaili, who is a wonderful member of the European Parliament who's done a lot to sort of further the interests of blockchain and make sure that the regulation on the European side is being developed in as sensible a way as possible. She was the only non-lawyer on the panel, so you're now looking at a bunch of lawyers, and one of us, who shall remain nameless, asked me to say to all of you that this is not legal advice, okay? Don't write this down, don't act on it. If you want any proper advice, it's going to be very expensive, and you're going to have to hire us. To my immediate left, we have Gary Shapiro, who particularly those in the US will certainly be very familiar with. He's the CEO, CTA, and owner of CES, which is a very, very large organization bringing together, I think, 2,000 tech companies. Is that right, roughly? Completely wrong. He'll correct me in a second. To his left, we have Alexandra Kramer, who's a partner at CKR. And then we have Marta Belcher, who's at Ropes and Gray, and Alan Cohn at Steptoe and Johnson. So an impressive cast of characters. Let's start with Marta, and I know, so what we'll do is we've got a couple of issues which we thought we would flag for you. There's a couple of issues that were proposed by the GBBC, but after about 20 minutes or so, we'll throw it open for questions from the audience, and then we'll do our collective best to answer those for you. But so Marta, when we were just preparing, mentioned that she's done a lot of work when it comes to the protection of IP copyright. I mean, that's obviously very important in the whole blockchain space. But I think it's also going to be really interesting to see how blockchain and you know, the technology it brings will change that area. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much. So I think there are two aspects to intellectual property and blockchain that are particularly interesting. The first is actually what brought me into the space in the first place, which is how blockchain companies are protecting their intellectual property. And so several years ago, pre-Ethereum even, there were a bunch of patents already being issued all over the world on blockchain technology. For example, if you remember Craig Wright coming out and saying that he was Satoshi Nakamoto, he, in tandem with that, filed a bunch of patent applications in the UK. And so we were seeing a bunch of these patent applications, and there was a big worry that this could lead to a big patent war that could ultimately strangle out the innovation in the space. And so for years, there have been industry-wide conversations about developing a patent pledge or some sort of mechanism by which blockchain companies can all agree that they can still patent their inventions, but at the same time, only patent them defensively. So they wouldn't be offensively asserting them against other good actors, but would have the patents to make their investors happy or to sort of clarify that in the space they had invented a particular thing without needing to offensively assert it. And then the other really interesting area that we had touched on was the way that blockchain is actually changing intellectual property. So a perfect example is, I'll touch on briefly, is in the copyright space, where you can imagine being able now, and a lot of projects are, saying, you know, for every second of a song that is played, you can automatically transfer 1/1,000,000th of a cent to the songwriter and 1/1,000,000th of a cent to the drummer. And that can all happen at a super micro scale. And that's something that I've been working a bunch on, but I will hand it over back to Sebastian.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I know that one of the people who is also working on that is Imogen, the artist, who many of you will have come across with her creative passport. Great idea. I mean, we often, of course, hear beautiful songs in a supermarket, but you always wonder, where does the money go? Be nice if we could figure that out. Elevators too. So, Alan, we had thought that you might first touch on AML sanctions and currency regulation as it relates to blockchain.
Yeah, so there's a very interesting phenomenon going on around the world as different jurisdictions try to figure out how they're going to regulate this space, because unfortunately we weren't going to get away with not being regulated at all forever. And while a lot of attention's been paid on the securities law side, or the regulation of financial instruments and capital formation, there's another very important aspect of global regulation, and this is around things like anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing. In the U.S., one could say that the U.S. is somewhat behind on the regulation of financial instruments, and Alexandra will get much more into that. But the U.S. was kind of leading the way on anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing regulation in this area by simply saying what a lot of us had hoped most regulators would say, which is that cryptocurrency is just currency. And so follow the currency rules, which seems pretty easy and straightforward. It has complications in its application. But you see more and more of the world going in that direction now, with regulators in Japan and South Korea, with the European Union and the 4th and 5th anti-money laundering directives, all kind of coming to that place of however else we're going to characterize it, we do need to look at cryptocurrency, crypto assets as currency for the purposes of knowing your customer, anti-money laundering controls, sanctions compliance. The other things that we are seeing, though, is that a lot of these regimes come with extraterritorial application, or at least the ability for law enforcement agencies and regulators to reach far away from their borders. And so we see that particularly with the United States in prosecutions of entities like BTCE and Alexandra Vinnik, where just doing business with customers in the United States is enough to establish jurisdiction for U.S. regulatory agencies and U.S. law enforcement, even if you have no physical presence in the United States. So as you think about the regulation of financial instruments and capital formation, always keep in mind that there is this other category of regulation, which in some ways is a bit more advanced and which comes with some teeth at the end.
Thank you very much. Alexandra, over to you. The sort of securities, employment, and tax implications.
So just quickly, by way of introduction, I'm based in New York. I'm the founding chair of my firm's Blockchain Technology and Digital Currency Practice Group. We have roughly 60 attorneys globally within the practice group. But I'm also, which I didn't mention earlier, a founder of a startup using blockchain technology myself. And so I definitely advise my clients, some of whom are in this room, on issues having both perspectives. So obviously I think securities laws have definitely made front page news when it comes to ICOs, STOs, token sales, token generating events, as they're known in Switzerland. And I think that's, it's been a difficult, although adventurous ride. I think what's unique, and I will put this out there because I don't think this is getting enough press, is that actually the regulators, certainly in the US, are really cooperating with attorneys in this space. They are open for business, both the SEC, the CFTC, FinCEN. I have regular conversations with them on behalf of clients. So this is not kind of the, black hole that I think a lot of folks think it is. They are really here to work with innovators to keep innovation in the US. Having said that, I will just give a brief anecdote of a friend of mine from the CFTC who was in Singapore November for the FinTech Festival Week by the Monetary Authority. CFTC decided to have its own booth at the FinTech Festival Week, along with investment banks and startups. And I said, that's a great move. You're really putting the CFTC on the map. The only problem was no one had heard of CFTC, and people would come up, have whole conversations with the CFTC until they were told, well, we're actually a regulator in the United States. at which point people started backing away slowly. So the message for everyone is that the U.S. is open for business, but you have to be careful. You have to comply with law. So in terms of securities laws, I would say, as a general statement, most countries in the world that have a robust capital markets will likely require you to register your security or find an exemption from registration. I won't go through all the details of how that works. You can certainly speak to any one of us, but there's no way of getting around it. Now, keeping in mind that cryptocurrency is not all of blockchain technology. There are many other cases of use cases of blockchain technology that have nothing to do with securities, that have nothing to do with doing a token sale. And the other legal issues I wanted to bring up is, so my startup is actually an employment marketplace for freelancers in the US that's powered by blockchain. People forget that there are employment legal issues, right? There are tax issues. There are estate issues. What happens to your, your key if you die? God forbid, going down the slope somewhere, right? So, I mean, these are issues that you need to think about before it's too late. Again, I think there are loads more legal issues we can cover, but that's kind of high level.
So moving on from death, Gary, can you cheer us up a bit?
God is not going to forbid us from dying. So I am here with 4 very smart lawyers. I have not practiced law since 1991. So
We're coming for you, Gary.
So I had a trade association of over 2,000 technology companies, and we own and produce CES, which is the largest business event in the world. It just concluded a little over a week ago. We had 180,000 people, 4,500 companies. We had a whole section on blockchain technology, but we cover the gamut of innovation. So I've spent my entire career starting out as a law student, actually focusing on innovation and new things and making sure that there's a proper legal and regulatory policy environment so they could flourish. Basically pushing against the status quo. It started with the VCR, making sure it's legal. That was a big part of the Sony Betamax case. It went to the United States Supreme Court twice. 5-4 decision, one judge made the difference. And that allowed a whole new industry to flourish. Also, when the internet started, I know I'm dating myself, but this is just reality. So I was fortunate to be part of an effort there where we realized, my best friend, who became the first Secretary of Technology in the world, the cabinet level in the state of Virginia at least, that we had to do business on the internet. So he said, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this bull by the horns. 1/3 of the internet traffic went then and still goes through the state of Virginia. Also AOL, which was the big deal at the time, Steve Case, they were based there. We had a lot of very progressive legislators, Republican, Democrat. We said, we are going to come up with a legal framework so you can do business on the internet. So we got together a commission of members of Congress, of legislators, and we created a model state law. That state law became the model for the rest of the world, which was adopted to allow commercial transactions, signatures, everything you need to have the internet be a commercial. Because remember, when the internet started out, it was for non-commercial stuff. That was the ethos of the internet. I know I'm dating myself here. She's laughing. She wasn't born then. Oh, you all weren't born then. The bottom line is, so where have we come? I have a new book that's just out. It's my 3rd book. It's called Ninja Future. There's a portion on blockchain. It talks about the technologies we know are going to be very critical for the future. Robotics, self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, blockchain. And it talks about the fact that if you want to survive in business, you better get with these. The problem I see is, and I'll say it as an outsider looking into you guys, is you all talk the same language. You all assume everyone knows what blockchain is, and yet I've been to sessions and spoken at sessions where even the people in the room at a conference on blockchain can't even describe what they're talking about. And everyone in the world that follows any of this, for the most part, 99%, define it by the cyber currencies and all the issues that are being shaken down to pay in a cyber currency, and that's what it is. The great uses of blockchain, which are fundamentally going to change the world and uplift, especially developing countries where there's no real property system in effect, and you need a real property system for democracy and liberty and commerce to flourish, will benefit enormously from blockchain allowing property to be assigned, in my view. It's an opinion, I know. So the bottom line of it is, my message as an outsider and not as a lawyer is to start defining yourselves in a way that people will understand what you're doing. All it is independent authenticity, whatever the word is, without giving up privacy. You don't have to go into all the details. It's just different ways of verifying something with multiple ways. It comes out with better system than either the yes-no system we live on today. It has a third way. It's kind of like you're the quantum computing where we want to go, where we're not quite there, although IBM just said they are. That's what you're doing in a way which allows the system to do it, and people will understand that. It allows you to preserve privacy, preserve all these things. And the lost currencies, the lost bitcoins and all that, when we all die, that's just part of the slippage of any system. So my suggestion is get your PR act together, and that's why this is a great organization to do it, and talk about some model laws. Figure out what it is you want to make it happen, because there is a desire among public officials to be considered among the most innovative nations in the world. We rank every developed country on how innovation friendly they are. One of our like dozen criteria is friendliness to new business models. Blockchain can be part of that. Right now, we look at ride-sharing services, hotel sharing services, all sorts of things, broadband deployment, all sorts of other criteria. Blockchain friendliness should be part of it. But there's no yardstick today for us to measure whether a country is blockchain friendly.
Thank you very much, Gary. I'm not sure what hotel sharing is. It sounds a bit dodgy, but I think I know where you're going with that.
Airbnb is what I meant. Sorry.
No, a lot of good stuff there. There's this beautiful publication lying in front of you called Beyond the Hype. So those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, please. You see, there we go, picking it up, reading it. I love it. So worth mentioning that a couple of years ago, when we started working with the GBBC, one of the things that we were trying to do was to create interest in blockchain. Very quick anecdote. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago that, thanks to this thing called Facebook, which most of you probably no longer use, I met my old friend Tomaika for a coffee. And after asking him, what he was doing, how his family was, I said, what else is up? He said, well, I'm doing this stuff on blockchain. Block what? Anyway, moved the film on a couple of years, and we were working together to try and get people in Davos to be interested in blockchain and to come to this dinner that was being organized. And we thought, oh my God, we've got this massive room. How are we going to fill it? Everybody's so busy. It was massively, massively oversubscribed. That was the first year. Last year, the second year, blockchain, I think, was the single, after European Union or even before, the single most featured word in the Davos agenda. Third data point. Our good friend John Oliver did a study on cryptocurrencies, which some of the people in this room maybe even featured in. And just coming to the hype, there was a point in there where he said that they'd studied a number of companies which had inserted the word blockchain into their name, and even if it was a plumbing company, their stock price had gone up. So that's funny, and I'm glad Gary's laughing. But it does also create a bit of a problem, right? Because there is this feeling, certainly in the crypto space, that it's been a bit of a hype. And how do you, coming back to the boring regulatory side of things, how do you make sure that people can benefit from blockchain and all that it offers, crypto and beyond, while protecting them from pitfalls at the same time? I think there's probably a couple people on the panel with views on that. So let me open it up to whoever.
I do think that it's worth remembering that the point of regulation is to protect individuals and to protect markets. And at the end of the day, that kind of brings a regulator's perspective in alignment with a lot of the ethos of this community, which is to try to protect the interests of individuals, right, and to protect the interests of marketplace. We have radically different ways of thinking about it. Decentralization, transparency, individual control being the ways that we do that. But at the end of the day, the interests are the same. And so, for example, the GBBC has had great success in engaging with regulators around the world in helping to educate them, make them more aware of this technologies, make it more aware of the potential that it has. And what I think is remarkable is that we're beginning to see uptake by regulators, recognizing that those beneficial aspects. So you see experimentation by customs agencies in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in the United States, in the Netherlands, saying that not because blockchain is this great technology and not because we all believe very strongly in it, but because maybe blockchain can give us higher integrity data in a much more rapid way that can help us safeguard shipments of goods across borders. And similar types of recognitions among healthcare regulators, among supply chain regulators, among insurance regulators. Maybe this is a better way to meet the shared goals that we have. And so I think that it is worth remembering that the goals at the end of the day are similar. The ways of getting there are very, very different. But as we think about developing these types of innovative ways in which blockchain technology can revolutionize a range of different things, that engagement with regulators and helping them see the shared benefit is really to everybody's benefit.
Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, I think I'm not ashamed to admit I have a bit of the blockchain anarchist in me. Anyone a blockchain anarchist? Okay, yes, thank you. We'll have drinks later. When I got involved in blockchain technology around 2013, 2014, it was sort of accidental. I grew up in Brooklyn. I met some really interesting young people in Brooklyn who were doing interesting things. And when I said, I used to be a securities lawyer, I think you might be violating some securities laws. They said, securities? We're beyond jurisdiction. I said, well, I don't know that the SEC is going to think it that way. Well, the SEC can suck it. Okay, good luck with that. So, there were others who were a little bit more risk averse and started asking me for advice, and I built a practice. But the fact is, ideally, there should be no jurisdiction. We should all be able to run businesses and have innovation without being limited by jurisdictions. But the fact is, we still live in the real world where there are jurisdictions. So the question is, well, how do we balance it all, right? There are international bodies like the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which to a certain extent, U.S. regulators will rely on. Who remembers the Dow report that the SEC issued July 2017? Okay, there is a footnote, two footnotes, if anyone is curious. Footnote 4 and 5, where the SEC is explaining that the Dow tokens were purchased with Ether, and it explains what Ethereum is, and it defines Ether, even then, as a virtual currency according to the definition by the FATF. So there is some hope that international regulators, who to a certain extent are working together. Val Shapiro from the SEC recently said, I heard it myself, that she is in talks with regulators across the world. But look, I'll be honest, the U.S. Didn't go as far as banning ICOs, for example, like China and South Korea, right? However, it's being super careful. There are much smaller jurisdictions, both within the United States, Wyoming is a good example, and outside the United States, like Gibraltar, Malta, Zug, and Singapore, Mauritius, and on and on and on, some of which are, to be honest, in my professional life, were a little shady, but power to them for adopting blockchain, that have the power, both financial and just in terms of their small scale, to really innovate when it comes to regulation. So I think there is hope. It's just keep in mind, we are in really early days of this technology, right? Regulators generally are very slow to catch up with innovation in many different areas. So the outlook is positive, but speak to a lawyer before you do anything in this space.
Marta.
I completely echo your sentiments, and I would add that I feel like regulators tend to have a deep fear of irrelevance, which is why the argument that, whatever this is not a thing you should be regulating doesn't work, right? Like, it's remarkable how, the CFTC looks at it and says, this looks like a commodity, and the SEC looks at it and says, this looks like a security. And I think that goes back to really being willing to engage with them. And it's true, it is remarkable how many times I've had to have the conversation of explaining to someone that just because you're doing something on the internet doesn't mean that you're not like a corporal being, and government officials with guns can still come drag your corporal being away, right? So I think this is, to echo your sentiments, engaging with regulators is absolutely the right thing to do, and I'm glad we're at GBBC where we're doing that.
But don't do it on your own.
Gary, anything else on that before we move to a next? Okay, so I'm glad that Marta mentioned the fear of irrelevance, because Gary was good enough to say that we've got 4 smart lawyers sitting here. There's another thing called smart contracts, What are they going to mean for us? Is it going to be helpful? Is it going to mean that the legal profession is changed dramatically to the point that there are some concerns that the way law firms work at the moment, for those of you who don't have the pleasure of being inside of one, is we tend to take smart young people and train them up by doing sort of the slightly difficult, annoying work for a long time. And then if you're lucky enough and you work hard enough and things fall into place, once upon a time you're a partner and you come to Davos and you talk about it. But, that initial phase of doing the hard work, if we have smart contracts where there's really little to do, does the work dry up? Where do you see that going?
Well, First, I'd echo what I think Sebastian is saying, which is that the transformation of the legal industry can't come quickly enough.
I love how he says what I think Sebastian was saying. Great, okay.
I think you were endorsing the idea of that this needs to change. The sooner we can get junior associates up out of the bowels of what used to be libraries, looking up cases that an AI engine could do, at 1,000 times the speed and much greater efficiency, and higher accuracy. And get the whole business of law to be about applying, synthesizing and analyzing the things that really return value to clients, the better off that we'll be. I think that smart contracts have a tremendous potential to really streamline and remove a lot of the friction out of day-to-day business in a lot of different areas. Realizing one of the goals of this technology is removing a lot of intermediary friction. And so when you think about disputes in supply chain, for example, who owned what, where was it when the dispute happened, where was it when it fell off the truck or fell off the ship, and who owned it, and all this kind of stuff, there's no reason why we should be fighting about those things. There should be a definitive source of record for that, and we can really talk about what law applies and how would that work. Where we can see with smart contracts, we can begin to say, okay, look, we know how those things should work. We know how those types of disputes tend to resolve. We know what kind of remedies apply. Can't we just automate that? Why do we need to bring that to a manual tribunal of some type? And so you can begin to see the marrying up of sensor networks with blockchain and smart contracts. You can also basically take that artificial intelligence engine that ingests thousands, millions of cases and say, well, we know for this universe there's this much precedent out there. Ingest it, and can we begin to apply that to disputes that come up? And so all of a sudden, do we have the ability to pull a lot of the friction out of day-to-day operation? Does that mean all the lawyers will go away? Boy, I hope not. No, but in fact, no, I don't think it will. Because what you'll see is then different types of disputes will come up. Different types of things that require application of human analysis will arise. But hopefully what it means is that we can strip out a lot of the costs and the friction associated with day-to-day, more routine dispute resolution, sweep that out, and reserve disputes for things where we really are presenting novel questions, where there are other issues that are just simply beyond the ability of lawyers and coders to foresee the challenges.
So I completely agree. And I think where we are right now with smart contracts, one of the projects I was working on this year was writing a software license that's transferable on a blockchain. So instead of transferring cryptocurrency, you're actually transferring a license. And right now, in terms of figuring out what is actually legally binding and how you make a smart contract into a real contract that's enforceable in courts, what we ultimately decided to do in our instance was actually to just write a human readable, human enforceable contract that sort of sits on top of the code and that the blockchain points to as a way of making sure that it would be enforceable in courts. So that's one example. But I do think that a lot of intermediaries, not limited to lawyers, but certainly will hopefully in a very efficient way be eliminated. For example, in the example I gave earlier with regards to music licensing, right now the way that works is you have music intermediaries, ASCAP and BMI, for example, and they are sort of a black box where a bunch of artists pay them, or rather give them sort of rights. They have some sort of formula where they literally go and sit in bars and figure out sort of how often these songs are being played based on their sort of formula without it actually being, based on actual statistical data. And no one is really happy with this. The artists aren't really happy with how much they're getting paid. The bars that are getting, in their view, shaken down aren't happy with it. And ultimately, it really is totally unclear and not transparent as to what is going on. And so that's a perfect example of intermediaries that would potentially be no longer necessary using smart contracts.
As an American, I think lawyers are VIG. They make us anti-competitive. You compare us with China. which is competitive with us in a whole range of ways. One of the reasons they have lower costs is they have fewer lawyers. Things are resolved, things are clear. They also don't have government shutdowns. They don't have a lot of debate about social issues that occupy a lot of our time. They're homogeneous. It's all a separate discussion. But the good thing about blockchain and artificial intelligence and other technologies coming along is that things will become, I think, less useful for lawyers. The thing about, I was on the board of George Mason University, Virginia's largest university. And I'll tell you, our law school was the most profitable portion of the university. Law schools are great. You have very little investment. You just need large classroom sizes. You don't pay the teachers a lot. They come in, you go through lawyers, 3 years, they pay a ton of money, no guarantees, nothing, no laboratories, no expensive doctors, no surgical centers, it's the cheapest way to get money out of a graduate student is to put them through law school. So every university wants to do it. It's very profitable. And what we end up with is literally hundreds of thousands of lawyers in our society that are underemployed. And then businesses hear from them. It's a vig on our society. And to the extent we lower the cost, that's a great thing. And I think we are doing that. This morning we had breakfast with a guy from Australia who basically he's legal Zoom Plus in Australia going to Europe. Basically says we'll eliminate the reason for a lot of lawyers. And it's because of ambiguity in legal situations as to what's going to happen. People threaten, and then they, ending up in litigation so expensive. Lawyers are not a great thing for society. They're a great thing to protect democracy, I think, but in the commercial world, the only purpose is really to make sure there's enforcement of contracts. That's the role of the government. The government can do that in a way which recognizes the value of blockchain as a legitimate way of minimizing legal disputes.
Gary, I'm very disappointed. This panel was supposed to be about how nice and great lawyers are, how everybody needs them. Oh, dear.
Shakespeare said it first.
Moving on. Questions? Yeah, well done, Gary. There's one guy. Yeah, I'm going to sue you. So, questions from the audience, please. Yes, Sandra.
I'm going to just talk out loud.
Yeah.
So there are, in business, people tend to gravitate towards certain jurisdictions because people are familiar with the documentation, Delaware, UK law. Do we see any movement from a jurisdictional standpoint with respect to the future of smart contracts or crypto, where we could see different jurisdictions come into play?
Great question, and one that we touched on in our preparation, so I know everybody's ready to answer.
Quickly, I'll just talk about Wyoming for a minute because Wyoming has a Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, which is led by Caitlin Long, who's coming out with a great book as well. And my firm was actually the first firm to nab one of the attorneys in the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. So we have a presence in Wyoming, which was clever because as soon as they passed 5 blockchain bills in March of last year, something like 20,000 companies incorporated within a few weeks. And Wyoming is an unusual state. People don't realize it was the first to introduce the LLC in the country. It's also called the equality state. But in any case, they are really at the forefront. They're called the Gibraltar, for what it's worth, of the United States. And I think they are challenging, they and a handful of other states are challenging the federal government, the federal laws, to kind of catch up. Because keep in mind, it's great, all the laws in Wyoming are fantastic if you're in Wyoming. It doesn't really help you or doesn't get you all the way there, let's say. If you're in other states or if you have customers in other states. I don't want to talk too much about jurisdictions that you should stay away from that we could talk about later. But I would say certainly for the U.S., take a look at Wyoming. I mentioned some of the other jurisdictions, but take things with a grain of salt, right? If you look at press releases from these governments, very often focus on the word pilot, test, sandbox. It all looks great until you dig a little deeper and realize there's really nothing happening. So certainly I'm a big fan of Wyoming.
I've also been working on Wyoming with the Digital Asset Trade Association, one of my clients. And I think, as you said, one of the major things is dealing with the interplay between the state and federal, making sure that nothing is preempted. And as you said, it really is sort of a way of spurring the federal government to move forward. The thing, of course, is that the reality for businesses is you typically have to be you really have to look at the state that is the not the most friendly to you, but actually the least friendly to you in dealing with your compliance, which is unfortunate. And the realities, as the name of our panel highlights, of blockchain technology, internet technology generally, is that it's really not practical to just have a business in Wyoming. And particularly, it's interesting when you see, sort of, as you had touched on earlier, the concept of just doing business. There have been a lot of ICO projects, for example, that say we're just not going to sell to U.S. customers. And there's a big question as to, well, if you can easily VPN around that, and you're actually saying things like, for example, if people in your forums are talking about how easy it is to VPN around that, whether you actually still are subject to U.S. laws. So it's really something that I think requires international coordination, and ideally trying to not just sort of lead the way forward, but also make sure that the jurisdictions that are dragging behind actually come up to speed.
Sorry, can I just add one thing about Wyoming, which I should have mentioned, which is really important? One of the 5 blockchain bills that they passed in March is one that actually addresses the token that is not a security. Right, so Wyoming is the only state in the U.S. that actually provides a legal framework to have this unicorn token that is not a security. And so it's very clear how to follow those rules. You have to file notice with the state. But for technologists in the room, that's important to point out. There's no other state and very few countries that will actually structure it that way.
Yeah, so what's interesting in that is that you have this kind of consensus, loose consensus developing around the model in Switzerland, right here in Switzerland, where you have the 3 categories: the currency tokens, your cryptocurrencies, your asset tokens, which are your financial instruments, and then utility tokens, similar to what Alexandra was saying in Wyoming. And you're starting to see other jurisdictions, Singapore, some of the smaller jurisdictions, Bermuda, others, beginning to adopt that same taxonomy. And the U.S. is going to lag far behind that because we don't have an integrated financial regulator. And so, as I think it was Alexandra just said, no U.S. regulator is going to, or Marta, no U.S. regulator is going to divest themselves of jurisdiction by saying that, oh, this isn't one of mine. So you do have this kind of distinction and gulf starting to open that could only get wider. What definitely seems like it's necessary is for the major governments that are active in this space to try to get together and to come to consensus around some basic principles around this is what we're going to regulate because it's capital formation or a financial instrument. This is what we're going to consider currency. This is or is not what we're going to consider a third category of token, whether we are going to consider that or not. If we are, what does that mean? It can't mean that it's out doing nothing. There needs to be what is important for people to understand about an open source platform that uses a token to provide access, to enable some type of functionality, and to be used in some type of consumptive way on that platform. And what does it mean to have a platform where you can exchange those tokens for one another? And start from a sense of principles that maybe countries can orient around so that we can try to close that gap, and so that we can try to find much greater harmony, regulatory harmony, across borders in that area.
Yeah, it's maybe worth mentioning that regulators aren't always bad, and there are some I know who are trying to. Not all lawyers and all regulators are bad, Gary, and that there are some who are actually trying to use the regulation of blockchain, cryptocurrency, and so on as a competitive advantage. The Crypto Valley, not far from here, near Zug and Zurich, might be considered one example. Wyoming clearly, leading the way in others. But we have another question from the room. If you don't mind just giving us your name and telling us where you're from.
Hi, my name is Julie Mopp, and I'm from the IOTA Foundation, and I sit in Berlin, so coming from sort of a German regulatory perspective. One thing that I notice about the panel, with the exception of the moderator, is there are a lot of American accents on the panel, and we're talking about borderless, law and order in a decentralized world. You have all, obviously, most of you are working for international law firms, and you have colleagues in offices around the world, and you've done a good job of highlighting leading jurisdictions like Singapore and others that are in Switzerland that are trying to be a little bit more innovative. But if I could push a little bit further on the point that you were just making about these international cooperation, or you called it international coordination mechanisms. If we look beyond FATF, what else is out there? What is the right forum for engaging? Is it the G20? Is it to sit around in groups like this at the WEF, which doesn't at the end of the day have any actual policy-making power? Because the international legal system is as balkanized as the US federal system, if not worse, in many ways. So how do you, on a practical level, tackle that challenge? I mean, groups like the GBBC are doing a good job trying to cast a wide net, but how do you bring those conversations into a room where you can, in fact, come around a common set of agreed principles? And then sort of as a second wrinkle on that, because I think one thing that all of you have in common is you're all coming from common law jurisdictions as well. So how do we think about that in terms of common law versus civil law approaches? Because the civil law is actually very much a principles-driven legal system.
So the civil common law issue is that's fascinating because you see countries on both sides of that innovating in this space. European countries from the civil side and a lot of the countries that adopted British common law, including the United States. But I don't see that one or the other has been an impediment, that countries have been able to experiment within both types of systems. And it would be interesting to know whether one or the other type of system is more amenable to true innovation in the space. I don't know. The other point that you raised is one that I think all aspects of technology law are wrestling with, which is what is the forum in which you can debate these issues. I've done a lot of work on cybercrime. The Council of Europe developed something called the Budapest Convention, which was trying to help countries work better together on cybercrime issues. And there are countries not in Europe who say, that's a great convention. I like every provision of it. I'm never signing it because it was the Europeans who came up with it, even though I agree with everything that's in it. So we do need a forum in order to debate that. I happen to think that it's important for us to talk in FATF. I think it's important for us to talk in G20, the OECD, ASEAN. I think we should go to every group that we can to have these discussions. But it may come down to convening those countries that are at the forefront of this, because they span across all of these organizations, big, small, large economy, small economy. Many of them aspire to be kind of the trading states of the coming world, not the great powers, but the city states and the trading states that will facilitate and broker among them. And a convening of all of them may be useful for a lot of purposes. But particularly along this, there does seem to be the need for a consensus among those jurisdictions, and none of those organizations seem to really be the right place to reach that.
Just, sorry, one more I might mention, and Eva would have been the perfect person to do this, but as per our earlier discussion, she is unfortunately still in Brussels. But she's been really driving efforts at the EU level. And so following Davos last year and the efforts in 2017, they launched the EU Blockchain Observatory in February of last year. In March of last year, they launched the FinTech Action Plan. So there's definitely a lot of efforts going on also at the European level. Now, it's a beast that moves rather slowly for a variety of reasons. And is that the best way? I mean, it's the eternal question. And I think Gary touched on that also earlier when we were still agreeing with each other. That trying to regulate, especially in the tech space, is really hard because inevitably, the companies move faster than the regulators do. But at least on the EU front, there is an ongoing effort there. Alexandra.
I'm just going to comment that I think it would certainly be more efficient for those of us who are sort of the legitimate, mature industry players to have uniformity. I think and it'll be cheaper, frankly, for lawyers, or for you when you hire lawyers. But there is a risk of overregulation, honestly. And I had this experience personally because we often work with both state and federal legislators around the world. Because I do think the push has to come from the private sector. But I had an experience where I ran an event in the state of Georgia, which has not been on the map for blockchain. And we invited someone from the State Department of Technology, basically, to come speak, because unbeknownst to many people, Atlanta itself has a very large tech community. And he sort of knew a little bit about blockchain, but afterwards, I had this slide on friendly jurisdictions and not so friendly jurisdictions. And so he asked me to forward it to him because he wants to talk to the higher ups. But the basic consensus between the two of us, if there's nothing stopping innovators in Georgia right now from doing what they want to do, maybe we should just leave things as they are. That's certainly my, founder self speaking more than my lawyer persona, but that there is a risk that it will just get overregulated and people will leave the jurisdiction.
I really appreciated your comment because you're right. And also the way you just framed the issues, I think is very helpful. So I wake up every day and I'm concerned about one thing, and that is if I don't do my job right, innovation will not flourish. Blockchain is a fundamental ingredient for innovation. It's so important across a whole range of human endeavor, a lot of which we can't even envision today, but some creative people in this room are trying to, and I think that's really important. The danger of overregulation is so great. And the natural reaction of regulators is to want to regulate. That's why they exist. They feel they're not doing their job unless they regulate. So for every new technology that comes along, one, because of status quo industries, and two, because that's what they're paid to do is to regulate or legislate, their natural tendency is to try to get ahead of the curve. The challenge is they often issue overly prescriptive, broad, innovation-killing regulations. So my job has always been to, I hate to say it, but often to try to provide a new perspective, to delay them a little bit until the marketplace catches up and they see these are not five-headed hydra that are going to destroy their world, but to rather talk about the behavior they want to stop rather than saying stop the technology. Because every technology has a good and bad, whether it's the wheel or fire or the computer or you name it. There are bad things in technology which will hurt people economically and physically. So the question is, how do you stop the behavior rather than the technology? So that's been our push all along. It does go, you're right, every international group you see, all of them, go after them. That's really important. But the missing ingredient is you have to help guide the way. You have to recognize that there are potential harms here. There are guardrails that government can and should set. And here's what we think they are. We think that this is an area where you should make this behavior unlawful as it is in the physical world. Why shouldn't it also be illegal in the blockchain world? And it's a healthy approach. It's a slow it down approach. It's an educational approach, which takes a heck of a lot of time. And it's sometimes not the popular approach that legislators want to take, and they don't feel like they're accomplishing something. But there are various international and domestic bodies that have model laws, and they're very receptive to being out there and being innovative. And the other thing, the tool that we've created with the 50 states and now globally is what we're doing is we're rewarding the good states and the good countries that we think are pro-innovation. We say, here are the behaviors we're going to reward. It's been remarkable for us. We have cabinet officials now that we had several of them on stage at CES in Las Vegas accepting the reward for being among the most innovative countries in the world, innovation friendly. So that's a carrot stick. The bad thing is if you're in the lower quartile, you're not very favorable to innovation. So there's all sorts of tools that innovators can use to get their way without just saying, you're bad, we don't like what you're doing, and coming in after the fact, after they've regulated, after they've legislated.
Marta.
One thing I might add that's particularly relevant in this room is that in 2018, the number of trade associations in this space exploded. And the trade associations often didn't even know about each other, right? And I have this conversation all the time with clients of which trade associations should I be a member of, right? I think that what other industries have recognized is that, as silly as it is, you really do need a meta trade association to be a coalition of the trade associations, because right now where we are at this moment is a place where there is not a lot of coordination and where there's a lot of duplicative efforts going on in the space, and also the last thing you want, which is to have regulators hearing from not united front in the industry.
So what you're saying is they should all join the GBBC, right?
Look.
There we go. There we go. That's what I heard. Any other questions from the audience? Dante, I see you hiding in the shadows. Or do you want to tell us maybe about your experience with regulators? You've got a pretty interesting business you've been setting up in this space.
Okay, there. I'll take the softball pitch. It's even better. So in the United States, financial services, insurance specifically regulated at the 50-state level. And other markets like the UK, you have a common sort of insurance regulator. Where in your world do you see this going in terms of creating, where there is, I think, the model law example we heard from earlier, how do you get that conversation started where you could start to bring regulators into the room? They don't see the innovation as threatening. And that what you're presenting to the marketplace ultimately is a net positive, that insurers would gain an advantage, that customers would gain better pricing, more transparency, and so on and so forth. I know GBBC is doing a lot of work to extol the advantages of growth and efficiency and all the rest, but in terms of law, finance, and insurance specifically, do you see any platforms where that can be done?
So I would say check with the local legislature. Some actually already are doing it. So in the U.S., there was already a congressional blockchain caucus, which is all male, actually. So I'm working on changing that. But in any case, and there are lobbies already in place. Right? There's a Digital Chamber of Commerce. There's another one that just came out. So they're following the kind of traditional world of lobbying Congress to move. I think that'll happen in other jurisdictions as well, if it's not already. I think that the GBBC is unique in the sense that it's international, and it's probably uniquely placed to be able to draw on what's working in one jurisdiction and not in another, and advise accordingly. But, there are, if for those of you, anyone see the SEC hearings multiple times, at Congress? I mean, it's sort of overwhelming how ignorant most members of Congress who are asking the freaking questions are about blockchain. Like, just sit home. I don't know why they're even there. It's almost embarrassing, honestly. So I think there's a congressman from Ohio who's just proposed some new legislation. I mean, there are individuals who have disclosed they have digital wallets and cryptocurrency portfolios, right? So that's where we're moving. I mean, I had a conference last May that I organized in Brooklyn called Women on the Block. Last minute, our Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney showed up. Is this being recorded? So thank you, Congresswoman Maloney, for participating. But that's what we have to do, is invite them to the table, right? They're not just going to appear. If they think that there is a constituent base that's interested in a particular issue, they'll come.
We're coming up to the hour. Any final questions from the room, or else final observations from our panel?
Thank you for letting me participate. I made a mistake when I accepted. I thought it was the Blockhead panel, but I was wrong.
It's amazing. Lawyers who have nothing to say.
Stick around. We'll stick around
There's
if you have
progress after all.
questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, true. Guys, thank you all very much. I appreciate that it's getting towards the end of a long day for many of you. Thank you very much to Sandra, Marcina, and the rest for hosting us. Thanks to everyone for attending, but thanks in particular, of course, to these 4 brilliant lawyers to my left for being on the panel. And 3 brilliant lawyers to my left, and Gary for joining the panel. Please give them a warm round of applause.